Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We now turn to a little poem called Roaming in Thoughts, with a parenthetical subtitle after reading Hegel. This is poem number 14 of the 29 of By the Roadside. And let's just point out really quickly that basically the next 15 poems are really short observations. Just a few lines, in fact less than 50 lines in total. And many have called this not really poetry. I would argue, and I think that Whitman intentionally did this in the final deathbed edition, as we call it, of Leaves of Grass. I would argue that if Whitman thought of his Leaves of Grass as the new American Bible, that he thought very much of this set of lines as maybe like his section of what we would call Proverbs. That is to say, these just a little kind of reflections and observations, which would then precede the book that I will call of Lamentations, as in Drum Taps and more particularly Memories of Lincoln. Now, we will say out loud that Whitman was very influenced by the great German philosopher Hegel. He started to read Hegel a lot as he came into his latter years. Of course, the great philosopher, Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807, so there's a good working date for you. Now, our assumptions are that you've been with us from the very beginning at LearnStrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt. You have your own, I hope, copy of Leaves of Grass, and you're just annotating it like crazy from inscriptions on. We've given a set of introductory comments to By the Roadside, and then we've worked with Dalliance of Eagles, and now we will turn to this poem, Roaming in Thoughts. Our Nortons, as introductory materials, will tell us the following. He says this way: like the preceding poem, that is to say, Dalliance of Eagles, this two-line piece was new to this group and the 1881 edition. Whitman felt that his own idealism was affirmed by Hegel's, and we should point out that idealism is no throwaway word, because Emerson himself did not like to think of himself as a transcendentalist, as we've said in all our lectures on Emerson at LearnStrong.net, but rather as an idealist following, of course, the great philosopher Immanuel Kant. Whitman felt that his own idealism was affirmed by Hegel's, whose dialectic, you'll remember this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, is essentially illustrated by these lines. The poet's own notes on Hegel were based mainly on two secondary sources: Hedge's The Prose Writers of Germany of 1849 published, and Grosswick's German Literature of 1854. Now, a lot of scholars have pointed out the importance of Hegel in the thinking of Whitman at the conclusion. Now, I just want to point out that you notice the word thoughts has come up here 5 times in Roadside, as we've said. We're going to get this word either as thought or thoughts. Reminiscence, thinking, musings, however you want to think about it. Let's just now look at the little two-line offering, Roaming in Thought, after reading Hegel. Roaming in thought over the universe, I saw the little that is good steadily hastening towards immortality, and the vast, all that is called evil, I saw hastening to merge itself and to become lost and dead. Now, we've commented a number of times at LearnStrong.net in 303 about the significance of the Hegelian synthesis. When we pick up, for example, the Martin Luther King Jr. piece, Oppressed Peoples Respond to Oppression in 3 characteristic ways. Obviously, one is acquiescence, as he calls it. The second, as he talks about it, is violence, hatred and violence. And he will say that his nonviolent resistance is a product of Hegelian synthesis. Well, what do we mean? Well, Hegel argued that the way we look at history can be easily understood as you have a thesis or an idea, you have its complete and total opposite, and the dialectic simply means the struggle between the two, which will produce in the end a synthesis, which will then become the new idea, the new thesis, which in turn will, of course, have its antithesis, which will in turn again produce the new synthesis. And to that degree, we're playing a game here in these 2 lines with Whitman. Now, we have said, as we will come back to again in our study of Drum Taps here in a few moments, we have said that Whitman is not a just blind optimist, but rather what I like to call an informed optimist. Now, his informed optimist is going to be rooted in an idealism that's Hegelian in nature. And here we're going to see that played out. By the way, the word roaming will take us back to, starting from Paumanok passage 1, roaming many lands. There we'll get that use of that word roaming in thought. Roaming in thought, notice the word universe is capitalized. I saw, taking us of course to roadside. Now all these are like, I saw these eagles mating, I saw this, I saw that. I saw the little, key word, that is good, notice capitalized, which obviously will make many readers of Whitman's day think about Genesis, the book of Genesis 1. God saw that it was good, and notice capitalized here. The good steadily hastening towards immortality. Now, of course, the word good will take informed readers of Whitman's day to Plato's Republic and the debate about justice with Thrasymachus at the conclusion of Republic 1. I've given full lectures already at learnstrong.net on Republic. Notice it is little that is good. However, it's steadily, that's a key word for Leaves of Grass, in the same way that growth happens steadily or over time. Right? Perseverance matters. Hastening towards immortality. Now, we've seen this word already used several times in Leaves of Grass, and of course we immediately jump to several of the important passages, Song of Myself passage 6 to think of one of those. This idea of immortality and the idea of the immortality of the soul and all of that is as well a part of this, taking us of course to Plato's Phaedo. He says, I realized or I saw that good is not very large, later he'll use the word vast, not very large, but it is constantly moving towards immortality. And, now to the opposite side of the Hegelian synthesis, the vast, large, all, of course we've seen this used so many times in Leaves of Grass, that is, notice, called evil. Now, you'll remember in starting from Paumanok, I think a lot of Paumanok is in a part of this. Go back to starting from Paumanok, passage 7. Do you remember this when he said this in passage 7? He said, I am the credulous man of qualities, ages, races. I advance from the people in their own spirit. Here is what sings unrestricted faith. And then, of course, that omnes, which will be that, let's go, the all, as in all together. Omnes, omnes, let others ignore what they may. I make the poem of evil also. Now, I've given full lecture on this, obviously, at Learn Strong for Talks with Walt. But notice, I make the poem of evil also. I commemorate that part also. I am myself just as much evil as good, and my nation is. And I say, there is in fact no evil, or if there is, I say it is just as important to you, to the land, or to me, as anything else. And then, of course, right after that, he will argue about inaugurating a religion. So, as we've said, it's a pretty radical kind of position to take. Notice he says the vast that is called evil. It's as if he's making the argument that there really is no such thing as evil, which will, of course, make us think about our St. Augustine's and Confessions and City of God, where he will make the argument that, in fact, evil is nothing more than the absence of good. So, for example, a hole in your garment, the hole is just the absence of cloth, and that's all that evil is. And, of course, Emerson will have played the same game in several of his essays as well. I saw, he uses the word hastening, to merge, and there's our synthesis, right? There's our synthesis, itself, and become lost and dead. Now, this word lost will take us back to Penned Up Making Rivers. This idea, oh, let me be lost, right? This idea of how he loves to use the word lost. And finally, dead, which takes us, again, back to Song of Myself, passage 6, as we have said. Well, what are we going to make of a little two-line offering like this? I think there's a lot going on here that philosophically, Whitman as philosopher, one of our 5 Ps, is quite remarkable, quite interesting. And he asks it this way. The last of our big 5 is theodicy. Namely, what about all the bad stuff that happens? Of course, there's a lot of bad stuff that will happen during Whitman's lifetime. When we get to Drum Taps, tragically, we will see it played out, of course, that horrific war. What are you going to make of all that terrible stuff, what he will call the vast evil? And the argument is simply, well, what? That history is basically where the good ultimately will always, can we say defeat? Can we say transcend? Go beyond the evil. That there really is no evil in the end, because evil is nothing more than the absence of good. And even though there's just a little bit of good, a little bit of good will always transcend the large or the vast amount of evil. Well, at 2b, I love how this poem, and I've said to you guys before, I think Whitman is smiling and laughing all the way through Leaves of Grass as he is composing these poems. And I think here, notice, he has the Hegelian synthesis, and he literally is playing it out right there in 2 lines. In other words, Almost like, as we have talked about it in earlier lectures on Hamlet, the Act 3, to be or not to be speech. In other words, we have diametric opposites, right? Which one is it, to be or not to be? Here, of course, the good or the evil. In the end, which one ends up dead? And for Whitman, it's got to be the evil, even though there's more of it. Now, at 3a, I've mentioned already, St. Augustine, I mentioned, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. He predicated much of what he had to say about nonviolent resistance on the idea that we're going to take a little bit from those who acquiesce, and we're going to take a little bit from those who believe in violence. We're going to merge them together in a synthesis of Hegelian nature that will ultimately be nonviolent resistance. Of course, he, along with Gandhi and Thoreau, are playing around with one of the most important political ideas of the 20th and now 21st century. I've mentioned already Emerson, especially his ideas of nature, where he'll play a similar kind of game. This leads us finally to 3b and how you're going to own a little two-line poem like this. And this is why I love Leaves of Grass, because you can read a poem like this and go for a walk and you don't come back for 3 hours because you're playing around with a question like this. Do you believe in the end that good will, in fact, always triumph over evil? I mean, obviously our superhero films are always going to play that game. However, you'll remember that one of the most sophisticated superhero poems of all time is the poem Beowulf, where guess what? The dragon jacks Beowulf at the end. Of course, the dragon is killed with the help of young Wiglaf, but nonetheless, the hero, the superhero, is in fact, will we say destroyed? Is he triumphed over by the dragon? Or rather, does Beowulf in his moment of death triumph over? That is to say, how do you read history? How do you read your life? Do you really believe in your own life that in the end, the good always seems to win over the evil? Gandhi, of course, said this, because bullies can only last so long, and then they have to go away, and the good will always outlast, because the good, the just, as the great Mandela said, is always a light, and the light always shines brighter than the darkness. Where do you come down on that? I love that a little tiny poem like this could maybe send us thinking for a little bit. Thank you.